She had spent the last 6 Christmas Eves convinced that the blaze which consumed her home and claimed the lives of her twin girls was the cruelest truth a mother could face, until one ordinary afternoon at Denver International changed everything. Jane Matthews eased her sedan onto the shoulder of a lonely suburban road, the early winter sun dipping low behind the Rockies. For a heartbeat, she simply sat there, knuckles whitening on the steering wheel as she stared across the barren field that had once held her family's grand Victorian house. 6 years, and the sting in her chest was as sharp now as it had ever been. When she finally stepped out into the crisp morning air, her boots crunched over the thin layer of frost that clung to the grass. Each year since the fire, she had made this pilgrimage, an unspoken rite of remembrance, forced to stand on the same scorched earth where her daughter's bassinets lay in ruin. All trace of the charred structure had long since been hauled away, bulldozed into oblivion, leaving only memories that hovered like ghosts at the edges of her vision. Pulling her wool coat tighter, Jane crossed what had once been her front yard. This land had been in her family forever, built by her grandparents, cherished by her parents, and once filled with the laughter of 2 bright-eyed infants. She stopped at the very spot the hearth would have stood and closed her eyes against the icy breeze. In that instant, she was back in the house's nursery, the roar of the old heater sputtering its last, the acrid tang of smoke curling in her throat, her desperate screams swallowed by crackling billows of flame. That night, her ex-husband Royce had walked away, filing for divorce as she carried the twins to term. Her friends had gathered to console her, then drifted away in the dark. And when she awoke, the flames had already devoured half the home. Firefighters had dragged her out, but it wasn't until the smoke cleared that she understood the nursery was gone too. Nothing remained but molten metal and ash, the tiny cradles and bodies alike, too destroyed for even DNA to identify. A breath of frigid air stole her reverie. "They're safe now," she muttered, a mantra she'd clung to like a lifeline. "They're in heaven." But the weight of those words felt hollow this far from the ashes. A gravelly crunch behind her pulled Jane from her memories. She turned to see the sleek black SUV draw up behind her car. The passenger door opened, and out walked Robert Nelson, her friend, her manager at Colorado Luxury Properties, the one person who had never let her face these years alone. His salt and pepper hair caught the wan winter light, and his coat looked far too expensive for this silent stretch of land. Concern softened his features as he approached. "I figured I'd find you here," he said, sliding his hands into his coat pockets. Jane managed a small, wry smile. "Am I that predictable?" "Only to those who know you best," he replied, stepping to her side. His gaze followed hers over the empty expanse. "How are you holding up?" "Fine," she lied, then exhaled a shaky sigh. "Actually, I've made a decision, Robert." He raised an eyebrow, bracing himself. "You're selling?" She nodded, looking out across the field one last time. "I can't stay tethered to this place any longer. I've been debating for years, but now I'm ready to let go. With the proceeds and what I've managed to save, I finally have the capital to launch that design consultancy I've always dreamed of." Robert considered her words, then offered, "You could rebuild here, turn it into offices or rent it out. We've seen what happens when people fail to vet tenants, but—" Jane shook her head firmly. "I don't want this land tied to my future anymore. The memories are too painful, and I've seen enough horror stories in our line of work to know it's not worth the risk." He gave a soft nod of understanding. "You're probably right. Renters can be nightmares." They fell silent, 2 old friends standing amid the emptiness. Robert had been by her side since before the twins were born, through her bitter divorce, the high-risk pregnancy, and the long, trauma-haunted months after the fire. Despite everything, their bond had never crossed the line into romance. That part of her heart felt frozen, as if still buried in those ashes. "I still remember when I told Royce I wouldn't give up my career," Jane began quietly. "He wanted me home full-time. When I refused, He filed. I was 5 months pregnant with our daughters. Robert gave her a supportive smile, one she'd seen countless times. Thank God for that prenup, he murmured. And thank God you held your ground. Jane allowed herself a small, genuine smile in return. I wouldn't have survived otherwise. Specialty formula for twins alone cost more than I ever imagined. And with my health issues ruling out breastfeeding, it was a battle every day. You did right by them, and by yourself, Robert said gently. That resolve is why I respect you so much. Reaching into her pocket, Jane pulled out her phone. Let's start the paperwork. I want to list this place as soon as possible. Can you prepare the marketing materials? Absolutely, Robert replied, pulling out his own phone. I'll personally oversee it. He glanced at the screen. Funny timing. Actually, I'm heading to Utah today to tour a high-end property for a client. But I'll circle back first thing tomorrow. Jane's lips curved in a tired but genuine smile. Thanks, she said softly. I appreciate you, Robert. They shared a companionable silence, two friends standing on hallowed ground, ready to close one painful chapter and begin another. She blinked in surprise at Robert's last-minute revelation. You'll be gone for 3 days. Part work, part unwinding. It's been a hectic few months, he said, hesitating before slipping in with a tone that betrayed hope. You could come with me, you know. A change of scenery might do you good. Jane's instinct was to decline, but something in her chest fluttered at the possibility. After all, she had just resolved to let go of the land that tied her to the past. You know what? She found herself saying, I think I will. It's been ages since I've been anywhere. I can even help with the client meeting. The warmth that spread across Robert's face felt unexpected and welcome. Perfect, he replied. Let's meet at the airport in 2 hours. Flight departs at noon. She watched him check his watch. I should get going. Need to finish packing. Wait, she asked. You came all the way out here even though you're traveling today? He shrugged with a gentle smile. You said you wanted to talk property. This was important to you. I could have rescheduled, but I didn't want to. Jane returned his smile, a real one this time, and climbed into her car. Standing alone beside that empty lot one last time, she felt the first lightness in her chest in years. Back in her downtown Denver apartment, an austere one-bedroom that had become as impersonal as her life since the fire, Jane laid open her tiny suitcase on the bed. 3 days in Utah, business casual for the meeting, comfy clothes for downtime. As she packed, she muttered to the empty room, This is the right choice. That chapter is closed. But as she zipped the case shut, a flicker of hesitation stopped her. She crossed to her dresser drawer, the one she seldom opened, and lifted out a small wooden box of mementos she'd salvaged. Her fingers trembled as she opened it, revealing among faded photographs an acrylic keychain bearing a newborn snapshot of her daughters, their names, birth date, and weights etched beneath. After a moment's pause, she clipped it to her purse zipper. Time to keep you closer, she whispered, her voice thick with both sorrow and a fragile hope. Her phone buzzed. Robert, on my way to the airport. See you soon. She replied in a flash, gathered her things, and headed out. Driving toward Denver International, she realized she hadn't felt anything like anticipation in years. Maybe, she thought, that was a good sign. At the airport, Robert greeted her with that easy grin of his and a neatly rolled carry-on. Perfect timing, he said. The office already started on the marketing materials for your property. That was quick, Jane laughed, settling beside him in line for security. I emailed them while en route, wanted to get the ball rolling. After clearing security and finding their gate, they sank into their seats on the plane. Jane reviewed the property details he'd sent. Robert caught up on emails. When the aircraft touched down in Salt Lake City with a gentle bump, they collected their bags and followed the flow of passengers into the festive terminal, holiday garlands brightening the bustling crowd. Client picks us up tomorrow morning, Robert explained as they stepped into the main hall. Today we settle in and prepare. Jane adjusted the strap of her purse, the keychain clicking softly against her side, and nodded. "Which hotel again?" "The Grand Summit, about 20 minutes out," he replied, and together they wove through the travelers, each step carrying Jane further from her grief and closer to a new beginning. They moved along the travelator toward baggage claim, Jane's gaze drifting through the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the concourse below. That's when she saw them, 2 little girls, each clad in matching pink winter coats, honey blonde hair tied in identical ponytails. One spun in dizzying circles while the other reached out to catch her, their laughter rising like bells and drawing smiles from passing travelers. Jane couldn't help but return their joyous energy with a smile of her own. "Look at them," she murmured to Robert, nodding toward the scene below. "They're 6, maybe, and from the way they're dressed, must be here on some lavish holiday." Robert followed her gaze. "They seem to be having the time of their lives," he agreed, shading his eyes against the glare. Jane peered around for whoever was watching them, curiosity tugging at her. A few feet behind the girls stood an elegant woman in an expensive wool coat, silver hair cut in a precise bob. Jane's stomach dropped. Her feet felt glued to the moving walkway. One small girl clambered onto a large blue suitcase, arms outstretched, as though she'd just planted a flag at the summit of Everest. At that moment, recognition hit Jane like a thunderclap. "Robert, she started, attempting to step backward against the direction of the travelator. "Jane, what are you doing?" Robert grabbed her elbow, steadying her. "I have to. She's there." Jane's voice trembled, and she fumbled to move toward the stairs ahead, heart hammering in her chest. "You can't go backward on this," Robert warned, glancing over his shoulder at an impatient traveler who muttered, "Lady, what's your problem?" A second voice barked about airport etiquette. Begrudgingly, Jane stopped resisting, the walkway carrying her ever farther from the spot. As soon as the moving floor spat her out at its end, she bolted toward the staircase and sprinted back on foot, Robert close behind. "Jane, slow down. Talk to me," he called, worry etching his voice. She skidded to a halt at the top of the stairs overlooking the baggage claim. Her eyes scanned the carousel, the sea of faces, each suitcase that slid past. "It's Lucia," she whispered, voice barely more than a breath. "My ex-mother-in-law, Lucia Calloway." Robert crouched beside her, tone gentle. "Are you certain?" Jane pressed both hands flat against the glass barrier, knuckles whitening. "Those girls, they're the perfect age, twins." Robert's forehead creased as he peered down. "But your daughters, they died. We saw the reports." "I know," Jane said, voice cracking. "I know what the police said. But," she shook her head, tears pricking her eyes as she tried to still her frantic breathing. He reached out and touched her shoulder. "Okay, let's stay calm. Maybe they're someone else's twins." Jane forced herself to nod, though her heart refused to settle. Let's walk closer when we head out." They climbed the escalator down to the terminal floor. The spreadsheet-efficient hum of the airport washed around them, but Jane felt as if she were drifting through fog. When they reached the carousel again, the spot where Lucia and the girls had been was empty. A surge of disappointment washed through Jane, yet a small spark of relief too. They must have moved on, Robert guessed, checking his watch. "Let's try near the exits." They threaded through the crowd toward the arrivals doors, where anxious families and hired drivers clustered. Jane's pulse quickened when she saw a flash of pink. There, in a short line of waiting passengers, stood the twin girls in their matching coats, Lucia beside them, absorbed in her phone. Jane's throat tightened. She swallowed hard and turned to Robert. "I need to talk to her," she whispered, every ounce of resolve gathering in her chest. "No matter what. Jane, are you sure that's wise?" Robert's voice trembled with concern as they edged closer to the exit doors. "I have to know," Jane insisted, heart pounding. Before he could object, she stepped past him, weaving through the crowd toward Lucia and the twins. Lucia looked up from her phone, her perfectly coiffed bob and tailored wool coat as immaculately in place as always. Recognition flickered in her pale eyes, transforming her serene expression into one of taut surprise. "Lucia," Jane said, forcing a polite smile, though her pulse thundered in her ears. "Fancy seeing you here." "Jane," Lucia replied, her lips curving into a forced smile that barely registered on her face. An awkward silence fell as the twins halted their whispering games and tilted their heads, curiosity bright in their matching blue eyes. "How have you been?" Jane ventured, trying to sound as casual as possible while her gaze flicked between the girls and their grandmother. "Very well," Lucia said coolly. "And what brings you to Salt Lake City? I thought you never left Denver." "Business trip," Jane answered, nodding toward Robert, who stood a respectful distance away. "I'm here with my manager. We're meeting a client tomorrow about a property." Lucia's tone sharpened, her words thinly veiled scorn. "Still at Colorado Luxury Properties, then? It's admirable that your career thrives, especially during the holidays when most mothers would be home with their children." The barb hit Jane like a slap. She blinked, confusion and a rush of anger washing over her. If Lucia truly knew about the twins, why would she lash out so cruelly? "Lucia, I'm surprised you never reached out after the fire," Jane said, steadying her voice. "You didn't hear what happened?" Lucia's eyebrows lifted in genuine perplexity. "What fire?" Jane felt the ground shift beneath her. "The fire 6 years ago on Christmas Eve. My house burned down, and my daughters—" Her voice cracked as she spoke their names aloud. "Millie and Daphne died in the blaze." A flicker of something, surprise, concern, calculation, passed over Lucia's face before it snapped back to cold detachment. "So you won custody, then lost them. They should have stayed with Royce, not in that decrepit old house." Jane's breath caught in her throat. A grandmother's grief would wail, not sneer. She swallowed hard, trying to make sense of the callousness. The twins at Lucia's side whispered to one another, wide-eyed and innocent, oblivious to the storm swirling around their grandmother's disdain. "Are you here on holiday with friends?" Jane pressed on, desperation creeping in. "Or has Mark settled down?" Referring to Royce's younger brother. Lucia's posture stiffened, her patience worn thin. "That's none of your business, Jane. I was merely making conversation." She glanced at the moving line of taxis forming behind them. "Girls, the line's moving." Obediently, the twins gathered their small suitcases and hurried after her, still casting curious glances at Jane, who stood frozen for a moment longer. With a final hollow nod, she murmured, "It was nice seeing you, Lucia," and turned away. Robert slipped an arm around her, guiding her out into the crisp Utah air. "That didn't go well," he observed gently as they joined the taxi queue. "No," Jane admitted, voice taut with emotion. "And something's very wrong." She acted as if she never heard a word about the fire or the girls. Robert frowned. "Royce told her, right?" "He must have," Jane said, shaking her head. "He sent flowers to the memorial service. He was practically attached to his mother." They climbed into a waiting cab, and as the city lights of Salt Lake shimmered behind them, Jane pressed her hand to the keychain clipped to her purse, the tiny faces of Millie and Daphne smiling up at her. She drew in a slow, steadying breath. Whatever secrets lay beneath Lucia's icy veneer, Jane knew she wouldn't rest until she uncovered the truth. Robert's brow furrowed in agreement. This was far too bizarre. Before he could suggest another approach, Jane seized his arm and tugged him toward the pickup lanes. Through the glass, she spotted a gleaming black sedan draw up curbside. The driver, dressed crisply in uniform, opened the rear door, and there, stepping out with a confident stride, was Royce Calloway himself. Tall, impeccably dressed, and unmistakable even after all these years. "He's here," Jane whispered, her grip tightening on Robert's sleeve as Royce swept a kiss across Lucia's cheek and then knelt to embrace the two little girls, who ran to him shrieking with delight. It was a perfect tableau of family wealth and beauty, so picture-perfect that Jane's first instinct was to storm forward and demand answers. She lurched ahead until Robert's firm hand checked her movement. "Think this through, Jane," he urged. "If you confront him now, they'll pull away, and we'll lose them forever." She paused, heart thundering in her chest. "Then what do we do?" Robert's voice was steady. "We follow them. Let's catch a taxi, keep our distance, and see where they go. That's the only way to figure out what's really happening." Jane took a steadying breath and nodded. They slipped into the taxi queue, and Robert intercepted the next cabbie. "Excuse me," he began. "We need your help." The driver looked up, bleary-eyed from a long day's shift. "Where to?" "Follow that Lincoln," Jane said, pointing at Royce's black car. "Keep back. Just trail them far enough to see where they end up." "Lady, this isn't Hollywood," the driver grumbled. "I don't chase people." Jane's voice went soft but urgent. "I'll pay double your fare up front. We just need to know where they're going." The driver narrowed his eyes, weighing the offer. Robert chimed in. "Nothing illegal, I promise. We simply want to watch, not block or interfere." After a tense moment, the driver sighed and nodded. "Double fare up front, and I'm only following to a reasonable point. If anything sketchy happens, I'm out." Jane fished a wad of bills from her wallet, handing it over without hesitation. They piled into the cab, hearts pounding, and the chase was on. Royce's Lincoln slid away from the airport, Robert and Jane's taxi trailing several car lengths behind. Jane murmured an apology into Robert's ear. "I'm sorry you're caught up in this." Robert shook his head, eyes on the road ahead. "I'd rather be here, helping you, than anywhere else." Seconds later, it dawned on Jane that she knew more than she'd let on. "You had dinner plans tonight with the client, right?" she asked. He glanced at her, surprised. "How did you—" "You told me tomorrow's site visit. I figured there'd be a preliminary dinner." He smiled wryly. "Yes, 8 o'clock. But I'll reschedule. This is far more important." They drove in silence as the Lincoln wound through Salt Lake City streets, eventually veering onto quiet suburban roads. "They're heading out into the outskirts," the driver observed after nearly an hour. "You sure you want to go this far? The meter's high." "It's fine," Jane replied, though unease knotted her stomach. Every mile they covered only deepened the mystery. The Lincoln finally swung through an ornate wrought iron gate, disappearing down a long, tree-lined driveway toward a grand stone mansion set back from the road. The taxi slowed to a halt at the gate. "This is as far as I go," the driver said, reaching for the door. Jane nodded, extracting more cash to cover the inflated fare. "Thank you. For everything." He pocketed the bills and offered a final nod of encouragement. "Good luck." Robert and Jane stood at the roadside, framed by neatly trimmed evergreens, gazing up at the imposing home. Royce and his family had vanished behind its wrought iron gates, leaving only questions in their wake. "What now?" Robert asked softly. Jane's gaze remained fixed on the mansion. "I don't know," she confessed, voice trembling with determination. "But those girls, they might be my daughters. I need to be certain." Robert slipped an arm around her shoulders. She pressed closer to him, drawing strength from his steady presence. Whatever waited behind that gate, they would face it together, and finally uncover the truth about Millie and Daphne. As they stood debating their next move, a white van slowed to a halt beside them. An older man with weathered features and salt and pepper hair climbed out, eyeing Jane and Robert with polite curiosity. "You folks lost?" he asked, voice warm but cautious. Robert put on his most reassuring smile. "Not exactly. We're looking for the Calloway residence. Would you happen to know if this is it?" The man nodded, introducing himself as Ed, the family's longtime gardener. Calloway asked me to deliver some special flowers for his daughters. They've just come home from boarding school for the holidays. Jane and Robert exchanged a glance, a stroke of luck. I'm Robert Nelson, Robert said smoothly, extending his hand. I manage properties for Colorado Luxury Properties. We have an appointment with Mr. Calloway to discuss a possible investment. Ed hummed thoughtfully. A bit late in the day for business, isn't it? We're actually early, Robert improvised. Our meeting's tomorrow, but since we were in the area, we thought we'd come by to get a look at the place. Ed seemed satisfied and moved to the back of his van, swinging open the doors to reveal several large ceramic pots bursting with vibrant, purple blooms. These are special order, he explained, carefully lifting one pot. A rare orchid hybrid. He says his girls adore unusual plants, keeps their sunroom quite the collection. They sound remarkable, Jane said, keeping her voice steady. Are they both at that boarding school in Nevada? Yep, for a few years now, Ed replied, lining up the pots near the driveway. Mostly living with Mrs. Calloway Sr. while Mr. Calloway runs his business from here. Bit unusual, but that's how the wealthy do things. Robert noticed Jane's hands trembling and stepped closer. Need a hand with those pots? He offered. Ed grinned with relief. Wouldn't say no to an extra pair of hands. As Robert helped Ed carry the orchids up the drive, Jane slipped aside and pulled out her phone. Her thumb hovered over the 911 button before she pressed it. 911, what's your emergency? The operator asked. I need to report a possible kidnapping, Jane whispered, voice flat with shock. My daughters, twins I thought died in a house fire 6 years ago, are alive, and I believe they're being kept here. Ma'am, please give me your name and location, the operator prompted. Jane supplied her details and the mansion's address, then recounted the airport sighting, the taxi chase, and the gardener's confirmation that the girls live here. Are you in a safe place? The operator asked. Yes, I'm outside the property on a public road, Jane assured her. Stay on the line. I'll wait for the officers. While Jane spoke, she watched Robert exchange animated words with Ed beside the front door. Then she saw Royce emerge, dressed in a casual yet expensive outfit, directing Ed where to place the pots. At that moment, the twin girls burst through the doorway, racing across the pristine lawn to inspect the new flowers. Sunlight glinted off their honey-blonde ponytails as they laughed, and Jane's breath caught in her throat. There was no mistaking it. Every line of their faces, the way they moved. It was Millie and Daphne. Those are my babies, she whispered into the phone, voice trembling with emotion. The operator confirmed that officers were en route. From her hiding spot behind a tall, ornamental shrub, Jane watched as Royce turned toward Robert, curiosity flickering in his eyes. On the other end of the line, the operator continued gathering details, and Jane felt the world pivot beneath her feet, her long-held grief giving way to a whirlwind of hope and fear. Jane stepped forward, lifting her chin so that Captain Reeves could see past the flashing lights into her determined eyes. I'm the one who called. My name is Jane Matthews, and those girls are my daughters, Millie and Daphne Matthews. They were presumed dead after the Christmas Eve fire 6 years ago. I have reason to believe they've been living here against my will. The captain's jaw tightened as he surveyed the scene. Security guards frozen in place, Royce's face contorting with fury, Lucia clutching at her daughter's hands in frantic denial. Reeves barked an order to his officers to secure the perimeter and separate everyone involved. One team moved to cuff the 4 guards who tried to intervene. Another gently guided Lucia away from the twins while paramedics hurried to attend to Robert's injured arm. Royce stepped forward, his tailored coat billowing in the cool night air, to protest, but the captain cut him off. Sir, you're going to have to come with us and explain why these children aren't where they belong. We're launching an immediate investigation. As 2 uniformed officers escorted Lucia toward a patrol car, her silver hair shimmering under the siren glow, The twins clung to Jane's coat sleeves. Millie's voice trembled as she looked up at her mother. "Are you really our mummy?" Daphne squeezed her sister's hand and whispered, "We knew we missed you." Jane's heart pounded so fiercely she could barely hear the distant scuffle as Royce was placed into another cruiser. With a deep, shuddering breath, she knelt in the gravel and wrapped her arms around her daughters, feeling their warm weight against her chest. The world seemed to hush for a moment. Only the distant wail of police radios and a lone owl hooting in the surrounding pines reminded her that this was real. Captain Reeves approached, his expression surprisingly gentle. "Ms. Matthews, we'll need to verify your identity and run DNA tests to confirm parentage, but from what I'm seeing, you did the right thing calling us." Jane nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks as she answered questions. Her daughters' full names, birth dates, the exact date of the fire. Behind her, Robert winced as paramedics wrapped his arm, but he caught her eye and offered a comforting nod. Together, they watched as the officers led Lucia and Royce away in handcuffs, their protests swallowed by the night. In the hush that followed, Jane lifted her daughters' faces, stroking Millie's honey-blonde ponytail and smoothing Daphne's cheek. "We'll get you home," she whispered, pressing a kiss to each forehead. Then she turned to Robert, voice thick with gratitude. "Thank you. I couldn't have done this without you." He managed a tired but genuine smile and gently offered his good arm for support. As the convoy of police cars pulled away, blue and red lights dancing across the mansion's stone facade, Jane looked down the long tree-lined driveway and asked herself, and us, the viewers, what it truly means to fight for the ones you love. No matter how long it takes, would she ever fully heal? Could a mother's love really conquer 6 years of lies and heartbreak? With Millie and Daphne safe in her arms at last, one thing was certain. Jane's life would never be the same again. The lead officer's confidential whisper cut through the tense air. Captain Reeves straightened, turning to Royce with measured calm. "Mr. Calloway, Desert Springs Hospital in Las Vegas, confirms twin girls were born there on May 10th, 6 years ago," Reeves announced. "Those birth records exactly match the certificates we reviewed." A ripple of shock passed through Jane. Royce's smirk of confidence faltered for the first time, and Lucia's grip on the twins tightened. Jane's voice trembled as she clutched her keychain. "But my girls were born at University Hospital in Denver," she protested. "I have the records, weights, time of birth, everything." Reeves nodded to the officer who had made the calls. "We've confirmed both sets of records," he said. "That means these children, Evie and Costella Calloway, are not biologically Ms. Matthews' daughters." He turned to Jane with sympathetic firmness. "I understand how devastating this must be. Right now, we have 2 legally documented families. Without a court order and a DNA test, we cannot remove these children from Mr. Calloway's custody." Jane sank to her knees in the gravel, the cold night air whipping around her. Millie and Daphne, slipped from her embrace, confusion in their wide eyes. Lucia hovered, torn between anger and relief. Robert knelt beside Jane, pressing a comforting hand to her shoulder, despite the agony in his dislocated arm. "Jane," he whispered, voice thick with impotence. Captain Reeves dipped his chin toward the house. "We will facilitate DNA testing immediately. If you are truly their mother, the law will uphold your rights. Until then, no one is going anywhere. We'll keep these grounds secure and arrange for expedited testing at the state lab." Royce cleared his throat, regaining some composure. "Yes, of course. Whatever you need, Captain." The officers moved to station themselves between the 2 families, while a small medical unit prepared to transport Robert to the hospital for his shoulder. Lucia gathered her daughters close, tears of relief mingling with lingering suspicion as she murmured reassurances to them. Jane rose slowly, tears streaking her cheeks as she wiped them away. She looked at Captain Reeves. "Thank you," she said, voice hoarse. "I want that test as soon as possible." He offered a solemn nod. "We'll begin immediately. Sergeant Miller will accompany you to the lab, Ms. Matthews." As the storm of flashing lights, whispered conversations, and shifting alliances swirled around her, Jane felt both the desperate sting of a cruel twist and a fragile glimmer of hope. The truth lay in the science of DNA now, and she would not rest until she knew whether these were her daughters, or if, heartbreakingly, they were not. Their pink coats still buttoned up over sweaters, tiny feet swinging just above the carpet. Evie clutched a well-loved stuffed rabbit, and Costella hugged a board book to her chest. They looked up at Jane and Robert with wide, curious eyes. Jane's breath caught in her throat. She knelt slowly, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Hello, Evie." "Hello, Costella. My name is Jane." The girls exchanged a puzzled glance. Evie's lower lip quivered, and Costella shifted the book in her arms. Dr. Wilson gently guided Jane forward. "They know something special is happening," she whispered. "If you use their names, they'll feel safe." Jane nodded, swallowing hard. "Evie, Costella, do you remember me?" Silence. Then Evie set down her rabbit and in a small voice asked, "Are you our mummy?" Tears sprang to Jane's eyes. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm your mother." Costella's eyes filled with tears, and she slid off the sofa, toddling into Jane's arms. Evie followed, wrapping her arms around Jane's waist. Robert stood back, eyes shimmering as he watched. Jane hugged Costella close, kissing her head, then scooped up Evie. The girls giggled into her coat, the three of them swaying together in soft light. Dr. Wilson and Captain Reeves observed quietly, giving the new family their moment. At last, Jane lifted her head to look at each girl's face. "I've missed you both every single day," she whispered, voice thick. "Nothing will ever keep us apart again." Evie pulled back to cup Jane's cheek. "We missed you too, Mummy." In that warm, softly furnished room, 6 years of grief and unanswered questions fell away as mother and daughters reunited at last. Outside, the world's wheels kept turning, but here, time stood still in the tender glow of hope and healing. Jane took a steadying breath, lifting her gaze from the empty hallway toward Captain Reeves and Robert, and then back to the small, toy-strewn room where her daughters had just been. Her heart thumping with a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. "Yes," she said quietly, voice catching with relief. "Please help me cancel his meeting." She nodded toward Robert. "And whatever arrangements need to be made for the girls to stay here a little longer." Robert reached for his phone, fingers trembling as he drafted a polite cancellation to his client, and then set it aside, his eyes soft with concern as he offered Jane a reassuring smile. Captain Reeves tapped his pen against the folder in his hand. "We'll organize temporary lodging for them through Child Protective Services. I know it's not ideal, but it will be safe and comfortable, and you'll be able to see them every day until the court grants your custody order." Jane's chest tightened at the thought of any separation, no matter how brief, but she forced herself to nod. "Thank you," she whispered, voice thick. Outside the window, the late afternoon light slanted through the dusty blinds, illuminating the motes of dust that danced like tiny fireflies in the tense stillness. The quiet hum of the police station seemed a world away from the chaos of the past hours, and yet everywhere Jane looked, reminders of what she'd lost and found swirled in her mind. She pictured the twins' faces, Evie's slightly crooked grin, Costella's serious, thoughtful gaze, the way they'd recognized the tiny bears she'd knitted long ago. Her chest ached with love so fierce it was almost painful. Robert squeezed her hand, and together they turned toward the door, where Dr. Wilson and Officer Martinez were waiting with matching twin-sized jackets, soft pink hoodies, more casual than the puffer coats they'd worn at the airport. "When you're ready," Dr. Wilson said gently, You can bring them here to collect their things, and then we'll walk together to the temporary suite." Jane nodded, pressing a hand to her throat as she swallowed back tears. "I'll go," she said, then hesitated. "Robert?" His answer was immediate. "Right behind you." She gave him a grateful smile and then walked down the short corridor, each step echoing in her chest. At the doorway to the small holding area, she paused, drawing in a deep breath and straightening her shoulders. Inside, the twins were seated on a bench, clutching their matching stuffed bears, buttons for eyes, just as she had sewn them. When Jane entered, Evie's head turned first, her eyes widening as though seeing a mirage. "Mummy?" she breathed, voice trembling. Castella stood, brushing a lock of hair from her face, uncertainty and hope shining in her gaze. Jane closed the distance in 2 strides and knelt before them, arms outstretched. "My girls," she whispered, voice breaking. Evie flung herself into her mother's embrace, Castella following, and the 3 of them melted together in a tangle of arms and tears. The soft thud of bare buttons against leather boots was the only other sound in the room. As they held each other, Robert and Captain Reeves exchanged a look of quiet respect, stepping back to give them space. Through the doorway, Dr. Wilson smiled, dabbing at her own eyes, while Officer Martinez stood guard with a proud, relieved expression. In that moment, beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, within the austere walls of the station, Jane felt a fierce, unbreakable bond knitting her life back together. The nightmare of the fire, the years of grief and searching, and the cruel deception of her ex-husband and mother-in-law all collapsed into the pure, undeniable truth of her daughter's laughter as they clung to her. When she finally lifted her head, wiping her tears on the sleeve of her coat, Jane looked at Eve and Castella and asked softly, "Are you ready, my loves, to come home with me?" Evie nodded, her ponytails bouncing, and Castella reached for her mother's hand. Jane stood, gathering their pink hoodies around them, and together, with Robert guiding them gently by the hand, she stepped into the next chapter of their lives, filled with the promise of new beginnings, gardens yet to be planted, and the unshakable knowledge that a mother's love will always find its way home. Jane paused at the doorway, heart pounding as she watched Evie and Castella perched on tiny stools in the station cafeteria, each holding a chocolate-dipped cone that was already dripping in the warm glow of overhead lights. Evie looked up first, her hazel eyes widening in delight. "Mummy!" she cried, scooping her ice cream as if it were the greatest treasure in the world. Castella set her cone down carefully and ran into Jane's arms, sticky fingers clutching at the fabric of her coat. Jane bent, lifting both girls into a hug that felt impossibly precious. "I've missed you so much," she whispered, kissing the top of Castella's head, then turning to Evie for another embrace. Robert slipped in beside them, his sling-clad arm around Jane's shoulders. "How is it?" he asked softly, nodding toward their cones. Evie grinned through a smear of chocolate. "It's perfect," she announced, licking a dribble from her chin. Castella pointed at Jane's cone. "Yours, Mummy?" Jane dipped a tentative spoon into Evie's spare cup. "Here, I brought extra," she said, offering Jane a taste. The simple sweetness brought tears to her eyes, but they were tears of joy. Over the next hour, Jane watched her daughters transform before her eyes. Where once they had been cautious and uncertain, now they laughed freely, telling silly stories about their time at boarding school, Evie's triumphant recital, and Castella's secret friendship with a red panda plushie in the gift shop. Jane listened, marveling at their resilience, at the way they still carried the bears she had knitted, button eyes flicking with pride as they recounted their nightly rituals. When their cones were gone, Dr. Wilson appeared at the edge of the seating area. "The CPS suite is ready," she said kindly, "whenever you're ready to head back." Jane gathered the girls close. "One more spoonful of adventure?" she asked, and they nodded vigorously. Robert offered his hand to Evie, and they stood as a family, newly whole, shyly hopeful, and strangely brave. As they left the cafeteria, Jane paused in the hallway, watching sunlight slice through a nearby window and dance along the tile floor. She drew a steadying breath, flexing her fingers around the keychain in her coat pocket. The tiny bears a reminder of a promise that had survived even the darkest of fires. "Where to next?" Robert murmured, voice warm at her elbow. Jane turned to him, eyes bright. "Home," she said, voice firm with hope. "And then, let's plant that garden." Hand in hand, with a fatherly friend by her side and two little girls skipping ahead, Jane Matthews stepped into her future, ready at last to believe in miracles again.